The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. I almost threw it away with the rest of the junk mail, but something about the cream-colored paper made me pause. My name was written in elegant calligraphy across the front. Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Not the block letters of medical correspondence or the sterile font of hospital notices. This was personal. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I set it on my kitchen counter next to a cold cup of coffee and yesterday's trauma surgery notes. Outside my Chicago apartment, the October rain drummed against the windows in a steady rhythm that matched my exhaustion. 16-hour shifts at Northwestern Memorial had become my norm, not by choice but by necessity. When you're the only trauma surgeon willing to take the cases others won't touch, you don't get to choose your hours. The envelope sat there for 3 days. I'd walk past it every morning, grabbing my keys and rushing to the hospital. Each evening I'd return to find it exactly where I'd left it, a small monument to my own reluctance to engage with anything that wasn't life or death. Finally, on Friday night, after losing a 23-year-old motorcycle accident victim despite 4 hours of surgery, I came home and couldn't ignore it anymore. The invitation was more beautiful than I'd expected. Ivory cardstock with gold embossing. Madison Claire Hartwell and Jonathan Michael Reeves request your presence. The wedding was set for the following Saturday at Hartwell Estate in Lake Forest. I read it twice before the name was fully registered. Hartwell. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 7 years. Hadn't seen any member of that family since the night everything changed. The night that cost me everything I thought I wanted and gave me everything I actually needed. Madison was getting married. The little girl who used to follow me around during family gatherings, asking endless questions about why I wanted to be a doctor, was now 26 and planning her dream wedding. The last time I'd seen her, she was 19 and crying in a hospital waiting room, while her father fought for his life 3 floors above us. Her father, Richard Hartwell. The man who once called me the daughter he never had. The man whose wife, Patricia, had been my mother's closest friend since college. The man who had promised to walk me down the aisle at my own wedding, back when I believed such things were possible. The man who hadn't spoken to me since that December night when everything fell apart. I set the invitation down and walked to my bedroom closet. In the back, behind years of scrubs and professional blazers, hung a single bridesmaid dress. Dusty rose silk, size 8. Never worn. It was meant for Madison's older sister's wedding 5 years ago. The wedding I was uninvited from 2 weeks before the ceremony. I pulled the dress out and held it up to the light. The fabric was still perfect, though the style had probably gone out of fashion. I'd spent $800 on it, money I couldn't afford as a resident. Patricia Hartwell had insisted on a specific designer, a particular shade that would complement the autumn theme. I'd worked extra shifts to pay for it. The disinvitation came via text message from Madison's mother. Sarah, given recent circumstances, we think it's best if you don't attend Emily's wedding. We need to focus on family during this difficult time. No explanation. No conversation. Just erasure. The recent circumstances she referred to was my decision to testify in a medical malpractice case against Dr. James Morrison, Patricia's brother, and the chief of surgery at the hospital where I was completing my residency. I'd witnessed him operate while intoxicated, resulting in a patient's death. When the family sued, I was the only person willing to tell the truth. The Hartwells saw it as betrayal. I saw it as my oath. Morrison was family to them, not just through marriage, but through decades of social connections and shared investments. He was the godfather to both Madison and Emily. He delivered Madison when Patricia had complications during birth. He was woven into their family fabric so tightly that my accusations weren't just professional criticism. They were personal attacks. The case lasted 8 months. Morrison lost his license. The family received a settlement that could never truly compensate for their loss, but at least provided for the victims' 3 young children. The Hartwells lost more than a family friend. They lost faith in someone they'd considered their own daughter. I lost my residency position. Morrison's colleagues made sure of that. I was suddenly too unstable for surgery, too emotionally invested in patient outcomes. My evaluations, previously exemplary, began noting concerns about my judgment and ability to work within a team structure. I was forced to finish my residency at a public hospital in Detroit, far from the prestigious program I'd worked years to enter. But I finished. I became a surgeon anyway. I specialized in trauma because that's where they needed people willing to fight for patients, regardless of their politics or connections. I saved lives in emergency rooms where politics didn't matter, where the only question was whether someone would live or die in the next hour. The Hartwells had moved on. I'd seen the social media posts over the years: charity galas, family vacations, Emily's eventual wedding to someone else, Patricia's promotion to hospital board chair. They'd closed ranks and rebuilt their world without the complication of someone who chose principles over loyalty. I'd moved on too, in my own way. I built a career on competence rather than connections. I earned respect through skill rather than social standing. I found purpose in a job that measured success in heartbeats and healing, not in who you knew or what you could overlook. But Madison's invitation suggested something had shifted. The fact that it arrived at all meant someone had given her my address. Someone had told her where to find me. The girl who used to beg me to let her watch me study, who dreamed of becoming a doctor herself before choosing art therapy instead, had reached across 7 years of silence to include me in the most important day of her life. I looked at the RSVP card. 2 options: accepts with pleasure or regretfully declines. No middle ground. No option for accepts with profound uncertainty about what this means. The wedding was in 8 days. 8 days to decide whether to step back into a world that had expelled me, to face people who had chosen comfort over truth, to risk reopening wounds that had taken years to heal. I thought about Madison at 19, holding my hand in that waiting room while her father underwent emergency surgery after his heart attack. I thought about her at 15, calling me at midnight because she was having a panic attack and didn't want to worry her parents. I thought about her at 12, showing me drawings she'd made of the human heart after I'd explained cardiac surgery to her. I'd been there for every major moment of her life until the moment when being there cost me everything. Now she was asking me to be there again. The rain continued outside my window, and I continued to stare at the invitation, searching for answers in the elegant script that could only come from facing the questions I'd been avoiding for 7 years. The department store felt like foreign territory. I stood in the formal wear section at Nordstrom, surrounded by silk and sequins, feeling as out of place as a scalpel in a flower arrangement. The saleswoman, Jennifer according to her name tag, eyed my surgical scrubs with barely concealed confusion. "Are you looking for something specific?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for customers who clearly didn't belong. "Wedding guest attire," I said simply. "Something appropriate for an evening ceremony." Jennifer's demeanor shifted slightly when she noticed the Rolex my attending physician colleagues had given me after my first successful heart transplant. Money talks, even when you're wearing hospital-issue cotton. "What's the venue like?" she asked, suddenly professional. "Lake Forest, estate wedding. Probably formal." She nodded knowingly and began pulling dresses from the racks: navy blue, emerald green, classic black. Each one felt like a costume for a play I'd never auditioned for. I'd spent the last 7 years in scrubs, lab coats, and the occasional conference blazer. The language of formal social events had become foreign to me. "This one would be lovely," Jennifer said, holding up a midnight blue dress with delicate beading. "Very elegant, not too flashy." I took it to the dressing room and stared at myself in the 3-way mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger. Not the confident surgeon who could repair a severed artery with steady hands. Not the determined resident who'd fought her way through medical school. This woman looked vulnerable, uncertain. My phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, my closest friend and fellow trauma surgeon. "Still planning to torture yourself this weekend?" Elena was the only person who knew about the invitation. She'd been the one to find me crying in the hospital supply closet after I'd finally opened it. Elena understood complicated family dynamics. Her own parents had disowned her for refusing an arranged marriage to pursue medicine. I typed back, "Buying a dress, send help." Her response was immediate. "You sure about this? You've built a good life without them." She was right. My life in Chicago was exactly what I'd built it to be. Purposeful. Independent. Free from the politics and expectations that had suffocated me before. My patients didn't care about my social connections or family history. They cared that I could save their lives. But Madison's invitation had stirred something I'd carefully buried. The 18-year-old girl who'd dreamed of belonging somewhere, of being part of something larger than herself. The girl who'd spent Christmas mornings at the Hartwell house when her own parents were too busy with their respective careers to notice holidays. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I bought the navy dress, along with shoes that cost more than most people's rent. The investment felt both necessary and absurd. I was armor-plating myself for battle with people who'd once bought me birthday presents. The drive from Chicago to Lake Forest took longer than expected. Friday afternoon traffic crawled along Lakeshore Drive, giving me too much time to think. I'd booked a room at a small boutique hotel rather than staying with family friends, as I might have done years ago. Independence had become my default setting. The hotel room was impersonal but comfortable. I hung the navy dress in the closet and stared at it like it might offer advice. My phone rang. "Dr. Mitchell? This is Madison Hartwell." Her voice was exactly the same, warm with an underlying current of excitement that had always made her seem younger than her years. My heart stopped. "Madison, congratulations on your engagement." "Thank you. I'm so glad you're coming. I wasn't sure you'd receive the invitation or if," she trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "If I'd come," I finished for her. "Yeah, it's been a long time." 7 years! "I know this might be awkward," Madison said, her words coming faster now, "with Mom and everything. But Jonathan and I really wanted you there. You're important to me, Sarah. You always have been." The simple sincerity in her voice nearly undid me. This was the same girl who'd called me crying when she didn't get into her first-choice college, who'd sent me a card when she graduated with her art therapy degree, who'd somehow managed to find my address despite her family's silence. "Who gave you my contact information?" I asked. "Dad." The word hit like a physical blow. Richard Hartwell. The man who'd taught me to drive stick shift in his vintage Mustang. Who'd attended my medical school graduation when my own parents were too busy. Who'd looked me in the eye 7 years ago and told me I'd chosen my career over his family. "He asked me to invite you?" "Not exactly. I asked him where you were, and he told me. He said if I wanted to invite you, that was my choice." "But Sarah?" Madison's voice dropped. "He looks tired. Really tired. I think he misses you." I closed my eyes. Richard had looked tired the last time I'd seen him too, during the depositions for Morrison's trial. He'd aged a decade in those 8 months, watching his family torn apart by conflicting loyalties. "How is he?" I asked. "His heart condition got worse a few years ago. He had another episode last spring. Mom doesn't like him getting stressed about anything." Madison paused. "She doesn't know I invited you." Of course she didn't. Patricia Hartwell was a woman who believed problems could be solved by simply not acknowledging them. If Sarah Mitchell didn't exist in their social circle, then the unpleasantness of the Morrison trial could be forgotten entirely. "Madison, if this is going to cause problems for you..." "It won't," she said firmly. "This is my wedding. I decide who I want there, and I want you there." After we hung up, I sat on the hotel bed and tried to process what I'd learned. Richard had given Madison my address. He'd known where I was all along. For 7 years he could have reached out, could have bridged the gap that had opened between us. But he hadn't. I opened my laptop and did what I'd sworn I wouldn't do. I Googled him. The search results painted a picture of continued success. Hartwell Construction had expanded into sustainable development. Richard had been honored by the city for his work on affordable housing projects. But the recent photos showed what Madison had described. A man who looked older than his 62 years, shoulders slightly stooped, smile not quite reaching his eyes. The most recent article was from 3 months ago, a profile piece about business leaders who were making a difference in their communities. Richard was quoted extensively about the importance of second chances and the courage required to do the right thing, even when it cost you personally. I stared at that quote for a long time. Was it a message, an acknowledgement of what I'd done all those years ago? Or was I reading meaning into words that had nothing to do with me? Saturday morning dawned clear and crisp. October in Lake Forest was always beautiful, with leaves turning brilliant shades of red and gold. I could see the lake from my hotel window, blue and endless, unchanged despite everything that had shifted in the years I'd been away. I spent the morning at the hotel spa, getting my hair done and trying to quiet the nervous energy that threatened to overwhelm me. The stylist, a chatty woman named Grace, kept up a steady stream of conversation that required minimal responses from me. "Big event tonight?" she asked while curling my hair. "Wedding. Fun, family?" I hesitated. Something like that. By afternoon, I was as ready as I could be. The navy dress fit perfectly. My hair fell in soft waves around my shoulders. My makeup was subtle but polished. I looked like the woman I might have become if I'd never left this world. Successful, put together, belonging. But beneath the surface, I was still the surgeon who'd chosen truth over comfort, principle over belonging. The woman who'd rebuilt her life from scratch because she refused to compromise her integrity. As I drove toward Hartwell Estate, I reminded myself why I was doing this. Not to reconcile with people who'd abandoned me. Not to reclaim a place I'd outgrown. I was doing this for Madison, for the girl who'd asked me to share the most important day of her life. And maybe, just maybe, I was doing it for the part of myself that still wondered what might have been if I'd chosen differently 7 years ago. The Hartwell Estate had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. White roses climbed up every pillar, string lights created a canopy of stars above the garden, and the late afternoon sun cast everything in golden light. Guests moved across the manicured lawn in clusters, champagne glasses catching the light like tiny prisms. I stood at the edge of the circular drive, keys still in my hand, watching the scene unfold. This was the world I'd once moved through effortlessly, where I'd known everyone's names and their children's accomplishments, where conversations flowed around shared memories and mutual connections. Now it felt like watching a movie of someone else's life. The valet approached with practiced politeness. "Good evening, ma'am. Keys?" I handed them over and walked toward the garden, my heels clicking against the stone pathway. Immediately, I felt the subtle shift that happens when someone who doesn't quite belong enters a space where everyone else does. Conversations paused for microseconds. Eyes flickered in my direction before quickly looking away. "Sarah?" I turned to find Caroline Webb, Patricia's sister, approaching with a look of genuine surprise. Caroline had always been kinder than Patricia, less concerned with social hierarchies, and more interested in actual conversation. "Caroline, you look wonderful." "So do you. Gosh, it's been years. How are you? Are you still?" She paused, clearly uncertain about what I might be doing now. "Still a surgeon. Trauma surgery at Northwestern Memorial." Her eyes widened slightly. "Northwestern? That's impressive. You always were brilliant." Then, more quietly, "I'm glad Madison invited you. She's talked about you over the years." Before I could respond, Caroline's husband David appeared at her elbow. His greeting was noticeably cooler. "Sarah, unexpected to see you here." "David." I kept my voice neutral. An awkward silence stretched between us until Caroline touched his arm. "Darling, didn't you want to find the bar?" They moved away, but not before I caught David whispering something to Caroline that made her shake her head sharply. I was already being discussed, cataloged, fitted into whatever narrative would make my presence here make sense to people who'd written me out of their story years ago. I made my way toward the cocktail area, where clusters of guests mingled around high-top tables draped in ivory linens. The familiar faces were older now, but the dynamics were exactly the same. The lawyers clustered together, discussing cases and vacation homes. The doctors formed their own group, comparing hospital politics and surgical innovations. The socialites held court near the champagne fountain, their laughter carrying just a bit too far. "Is that Sarah Mitchell?" The voice belonged to Dr. Helen Crane, Morrison's former partner and Patricia's longtime friend. She approached with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes, flanked by 2 other women I recognized but couldn't immediately place. "Helen, congratulations on your retirement. I heard you're spending time in Florida now." "Yes, much more relaxing than Chicago medicine." Her tone suggested that Chicago medicine had become somehow distasteful. "And you?" Are you still practicing? The way she said practicing made it sound like a hobby rather than a career, like something I was still trying to figure out. Head of trauma surgery at Northwestern Memorial, I said evenly. One of Helen's companions, a woman with perfectly styled silver hair, leaned forward. Northwestern Memorial? Isn't that where they send the challenging cases? We handle the cases other hospitals can't or won't take, I replied. Gun violence, major accidents, complex traumas. People who need immediate surgical intervention to survive. How noble, Helen said, though her tone suggested the opposite. Though I imagine it must be quite stressful dealing with that population. That population. As if the people I saved were somehow less worthy of quality medical care because they didn't have the right insurance or the right connections. Every patient deserves the best possible care, I said, regardless of their circumstances. The silence that followed was loaded with meaning. Helen's smile tightened. Of course, though some situations are more complicated than others. Sometimes loyalty matters as much as medical opinion. She might as well have referenced the Morrison case directly. I felt heat rise in my cheeks but kept my voice steady. In my experience, patient welfare should always come first. How refreshingly idealistic, said the silver-haired woman. Though idealism can be expensive, can't it? Before I could respond, I felt a hand on my arm. Madison appeared beside me, radiant in her wedding dress, her face glowing with happiness. Sarah, you made it! She hugged me tightly, and for a moment the hostile undercurrents faded. You look absolutely beautiful. That dress is perfect for you. You're stunning, Madison. Absolutely radiant. Thank you. Jonathan is so nervous he can barely speak, but I've never been happier. She glanced around at Helen and her companions. Ladies, have you met Dr. Mitchell? She's one of the most brilliant surgeons in Chicago. Helen's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes. We were just catching up. Wonderful! Sarah, you simply must meet Jonathan's parents. They're fascinating people. Madison linked her arm through mine, effectively extracting me from the conversation. As we walked away, Madison leaned close. Helen Crane is poison. Always has been. Don't let her get to you. I'm fine. You're not, but you will be. The ceremony starts in 30 minutes. Will you sit with Aunt Caroline? She specifically asked if you'd be at her table. I nodded, grateful for Caroline's continued kindness. Madison squeezed my arm once more before disappearing to handle some pre-ceremony crisis involving the string quartet. I found myself alone again, standing near the rose garden where I'd once helped Richard plant Madison's birthday rosebush when she turned 16. The memory was vivid. Richard in old jeans and a Cubs t-shirt, me in medical school scrubs between study sessions, Madison directing us like a tiny foreman. That bush is still blooming. I turned to find Patricia Hartwell standing 3 feet away, elegant in champagne-colored silk, her expression unreadable. 7 years had been kind to her. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her posture as regal as ever. Patricia. Sarah. She paused, studying me with the same intensity she'd once used to evaluate potential dinner party guests. You look well. Thank you. Northwestern Memorial. That's quite an achievement. I waited for the but that I knew was coming. Though I imagine it's quite different from what you originally planned. There it was, the subtle reminder that my current position was somehow lesser than what I might have achieved if I'd stayed in their world, played by their rules. It's exactly what I planned, I said. I'm saving lives every day, people who might not survive without immediate intervention. How admirable. Patricia's tone was perfectly neutral, which somehow made it worse than outright hostility. Richard was pleased that Madison invited you. Was he? He's always had a soft spot for you, even after, she trailed off delicately. After I told the truth about Morrison's malpractice? Patricia's composure cracked slightly. After you chose to involve yourself in a situation that didn't concern you. A patient died because Morrison operated while intoxicated. How did that not concern me? James Morrison was family. And his patient was someone's family, too. We stared at each other across 7 years of unresolved conflict. Patricia looked away first. Well, you're here now. I suppose that's what matters to Madison. She paused. I trust you'll remember that this is her day, not an opportunity to relitigate the past. Before I could respond, she glided away, leaving me standing alone among the roses, my hand shaking slightly with suppressed anger. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the garden. In 20 minutes, I would watch Madison marry the man she loved, surrounded by people who had collectively decided that my commitment to truth was less important than their commitment to comfort. But I was here. Despite their subtle hostility, their loaded comments, their attempts to diminish my achievements, I was here because a young woman had asked me to witness the most important moment of her life. I straightened my shoulders and walked toward the ceremony seating, ready to face whatever came next. The ceremony was flawless. Madison floated down the rose-petal aisle in a dress that seemed to capture and reflect every ray of the setting sun. Jonathan, tall and nervous in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, looked at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. The officiant spoke about love conquering all obstacles, about families joining together, about the power of commitment. I sat in the third row beside Caroline, watching Richard walk his youngest daughter toward her future. He looked distinguished in his black tuxedo, but I could see what Madison had meant about him looking tired. His pace was measured, careful, and when he placed Madison's hand in Jonathan's, his smile carried a weight that hadn't been there 7 years ago. During the exchange of vows, Madison's voice carried across the garden clear and strong. She spoke about Jonathan being her anchor in storms, her partner in dreams, her safe harbor in an uncertain world. Jonathan's vows were equally heartfelt, promising to support her art, to build a life filled with creativity and compassion, to honor the woman she was and the woman she was becoming. I found myself genuinely moved. Despite everything else, despite the hostile undercurrents and uncomfortable encounters, this moment was pure. This was love, uncomplicated by politics or past grievances. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the garden erupted in applause. Madison and Jonathan kissed, as rose petals fell from baskets held by their nieces and nephews. The photographer captured every moment, the golden hour light making everything look like a painting. The cocktail hour that followed was seamless. Guests moved from the ceremony seating to the reception area, where tables draped in ivory linen surrounded a dance floor that gleamed under string lights. The band played jazz standards while servers circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvre that looked like tiny works of art. I found my assigned table easily enough. Table 7, tucked between Carolyn's family and some of Jonathan's college friends. Not the family table, not the prominent tables near the dance floor, but not banished to the back either. A diplomatic placement that acknowledged my presence without making a statement. The dinner was exquisite: seared duck breast with cherry gastrique, roasted vegetables arranged like abstract art, wine that probably cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a month. Conversation at my table was pleasant. Caroline kept things light, asking about my work in general terms, avoiding anything controversial. Jonathan's friends were young professionals, engaged and interesting, unaware of any family dynamics that didn't concern them. I was beginning to relax, to think that perhaps the worst was behind me, when Patricia rose from the head table with a microphone in her hand. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this magical celebration of Madison and Jonathan's love. Her voice carried across the reception with practiced ease. She looked radiant in her champagne silk, every inch the gracious hostess. As many of you know, Richard and I have been blessed with 2 wonderful daughters. Emily, who couldn't be here tonight due to her pregnancy, the crowd made appropriate sympathetic noises, and our Madison, who has brought so much joy and creativity into our lives. The speech continued with the expected tributes to Madison's talents, her kindness, her artistic vision. Patricia spoke about watching Madison grow from a curious little girl into a confident young woman, about the pride she felt seeing her daughter find true love. Family, Patricia continued, her eyes scanning the crowd, is about loyalty. It's about standing by each other through good times and difficult times. It's about knowing who you can count on when life gets complicated. I felt a subtle shift in the room's energy. Several people glanced in my direction, then quickly looked away. Over the years, we've learned to treasure the people who truly belong in our inner circle. The ones who understand that sometimes keeping peace within the family is more important than proving a point. The words hit like precision strikes. She wasn't speaking to the room anymore. She was speaking to me, through me, making sure everyone understood exactly why certain people weren't part of their daily lives anymore. We've also learned that some people come into our lives for a season, and when that season ends, it's important to let them go gracefully, without bitterness, but with clear boundaries. Caroline's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently. I appreciated the gesture, but I was past the point where quiet support would help. Patricia raised her champagne flute. So tonight, let's celebrate not just Madison and Jonathan's love, but the strength of true family bonds. The people who choose loyalty over ego, peace over principle, unity over individual agendas. The crowd raised their glasses, most of them probably missing the subtext entirely, thinking they were simply toasting family values. But those who knew, Helen Crane, David Webb, the inner circle of Patricia's social world, they understood exactly what message was being delivered. I didn't raise my glass. Patricia's eyes found mine across the room. For a moment, we stared at each other in perfect understanding. She had just publicly branded me as someone who chose ego over loyalty, principle over peace, individual agenda over family unity. In front of 150 guests, she had positioned me as the outsider who disrupted their harmony, the former insider who proved unworthy of their trust. The applause died down, and Patricia returned to her seat with a satisfied smile. Conversations resumed around the room, but I could feel the sideways glances, the whispered explanations to confused guests who'd missed the implications. "That was uncalled for," Caroline whispered to me. "But not unexpected," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. The band resumed playing, couples moved onto the dance floor, and the reception continued as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted. Patricia had drawn the battle lines clearly, publicly, irrevocably. I was no longer just an unwelcome guest. I was a cautionary tale about what happened to people who forgot their place. Madison appeared at my side, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Sarah, I am so sorry. I had no idea she was going to." "It's not your fault," I cut her off gently. "This is between your mother and me. Don't let it touch your perfect day." "But it's not fair. You don't deserve." "Madison," I stood and took her hands. "You are radiant, you are loved, and you are starting a beautiful new chapter of your life. Focus on that. Focus on Jonathan and your future together." She hugged me tightly. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered. "No matter what anyone else says, I'm glad you're here." After she returned to her new husband, I sat alone at my table while others danced. The young professionals from Jonathan's side had drifted away, probably sensing the tension and wanting to avoid any family drama. Caroline had gone to check on her children. I watched the celebration continue around me. The laughter, the dancing, the joy of people who belonged without question in this world. Patricia moved through the crowd like a queen holding court, accepting congratulations on her beautiful daughter's wedding and her eloquent speech about family values. I had come here hoping for, what? Reconciliation? Acknowledgement? Some kind of peace with the past? Instead, I had been publicly marked as the person who chose principle over belonging, truth over comfort. But as I sat there watching Richard dance with Madison while other fathers cut in to dance with their own daughters, I realized something had crystallized inside me. Patricia was right about one thing. I had made my choice 7 years ago. I had chosen truth over comfort, principle over belonging. And sitting here now, I wouldn't change that choice for anything. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I had reached for my clutch, ready to make a graceful exit during the transition between dinner and dancing, when the band leader handed the microphone to someone unexpected. Not Richard, as tradition would dictate for the father of the bride's speech, but Jonathan himself. The groom stood at the edge of the dance floor, still in his pristine tuxedo, but somehow looking more relaxed than he had all evening. Madison beamed at him from the head table, clearly unaware of what was coming. "Thank you all for making this the most incredible night of our lives," Jonathan began, his voice carrying easily across the reception. Before we get this party started, I need to share something important. The crowd settled into polite attention, wine glasses paused halfway to lips, conversations trailing into expectant silence. 3 years ago, when I first asked Madison to tell me about her family, she talked about the usual things: her parents' successful careers, her sister's achievements, family vacations, and traditions. But then she told me about someone else. Someone who wasn't technically family but who had shaped her life in ways that were impossible to measure. I froze, my hands still on my purse clasp. Something in Jonathan's tone suggested this wasn't going to be a standard wedding speech. She told me about a woman who had taught her that being curious wasn't annoying, it was admirable. That asking hard questions was a sign of intelligence, not disrespect. That standing up for what's right sometimes requires standing alone. Around the room, I could see guests beginning to shift slightly, sensing that this speech was going somewhere unexpected. Patricia's smile had become fixed. Her champagne glass gripped a little too tightly. Madison told me about the scariest night of her life. She was 19, sitting in a hospital waiting room, terrified that she was about to lose her father to a massive heart attack. The doctors were doing everything they could, but the prognosis was uncertain. My heart began racing. I remembered that night with crystalline clarity: the sterile hospital corridors, Madison's tear-streaked face, the controlled chaos of the cardiac unit. But Madison wasn't alone that night. There was someone with her who refused to let her face that fear by herself. Someone who stayed for 12 hours, explaining every medical term, translating every update from the doctors, making sure Madison understood exactly what was happening and what it meant. Jonathan's eyes found mine across the reception area. When he smiled, it was with the warmth of someone who understood exactly what he was about to do. That woman was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and she didn't just provide emotional support that night. As a fourth-year medical student, she had no official role in my father-in-law's care. But she reviewed his chart anyway. She questioned the treatment protocol. She insisted on additional testing that the attending physicians thought was unnecessary. The silence in the room had become absolute. Even the servers had stopped moving. Those tests revealed a secondary arterial blockage that would have been fatal if left untreated. Dr. Mitchell's intervention, her refusal to accept good enough when it came to someone she cared about, saved Richard Hartwell's life. I heard Madison gasp from the head table. Apparently, this was news to her as well. Richard sat perfectly still, his face pale but his eyes locked on Jonathan. Dr. Mitchell never asked for credit, never mentioned her role, never used it as leverage or currency in family dynamics. She just did what she was trained to do: advocate for the best possible patient care, regardless of personal considerations. Jonathan paused, letting that revelation settle over the crowd. I could see the shift happening in real time, the recalibration of assumptions, the dawning understanding of who I actually was and what I had done. Some of you may know that Dr. Mitchell later found herself in a difficult position when she was asked to testify about medical malpractice by another physician. She was pressured to stay quiet, to protect relationships, to preserve the social harmony of people she cared deeply about. Patricia's face had gone ashen. Around the room, people were beginning to connect dots they hadn't realized existed. She chose to tell the truth instead. That decision cost her professional opportunities, personal relationships, and the acceptance of a family she loved. But it also prevented other patients from being harmed by a doctor who was no longer capable of providing safe care. Jonathan looked directly at me again, his expression serious but kind. Madison didn't just learn about courage from watching Dr. Mitchell make that choice. She learned about integrity, about the difference between loyalty to people and loyalty to principles, about the fact that sometimes protecting someone means telling them hard truths they don't want to hear. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I'm sharing this tonight because I want everyone here to understand something. The woman sitting at table 7 isn't someone who chose career over family or ego over loyalty. She's someone who chose truth over comfort, justice over convenience, and patient safety over social acceptance. Jonathan raised his champagne glass, and his voice grew stronger. Dr. Sarah Mitchell currently heads the trauma surgery department at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, one of the most demanding positions in emergency medicine. She saves lives every single day. She trains the next generation of physicians. She has built a career based on competence, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to putting patients first. People were turning to look at me now, but their expressions had completely transformed from earlier in the evening. Instead of subtle hostility or polite indifference, I saw respect, curiosity, even admiration. Madison asked me to make sure all of you know that Dr. Mitchell isn't just invited to this wedding. She's honored here. She's celebrated here. She's family, in the truest sense of the word. The applause started with Caroline, who began clapping with tears streaming down her face. Then Jonathan's parents joined in, followed by his college friends, then Madison's art therapy colleagues, who had only heard fragments of this story before. Within moments, the entire reception was on their feet, applauding not politely but enthusiastically, looking at me with expressions of genuine respect and admiration. But Jonathan wasn't finished. "There's something else Madison wanted me to share tonight. Dr. Mitchell, would you please stand?" Every instinct screamed at me to decline, to avoid further attention, to slip away quietly. But Jonathan's eyes held such genuine warmth, and Madison was nodding encouragingly from the head table, tears of pride rather than embarrassment streaming down her face. I stood slowly, still overwhelmed by the sudden shift in the room's energy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan announced, "the woman you're applauding taught my wife that integrity isn't negotiable, that real strength sometimes means standing alone. That family isn't defined by convenience or comfort, but by loyalty to truth and commitment to doing what's right." He raised his glass higher. "So let's have a proper toast. To Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who saved the life of the father of the bride, who helped shape the moral compass of the woman I love, and who proved that choosing principle over politics isn't a betrayal of family. It's the highest expression of love." The standing ovation that followed was thunderous. 150 people raising their glasses in my honor, celebrating not just my presence but my choices, my integrity, my refusal to compromise my values for social acceptance. I looked across the room at Patricia, who remained seated, her face a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something that might have been recognition. Her carefully constructed narrative had just been completely dismantled. Not by me, but by her own son-in-law, in front of everyone who mattered to her social world. But more importantly, I looked at Madison, radiant in her wedding dress, applauding with unrestrained joy, her face glowing with pride rather than embarrassment about her connection to me. For the first time in 7 years, I understood that I hadn't lost a family when I chose truth over comfort. I had simply learned to recognize what family really meant. The reception transformed after Jonathan's speech. People who had avoided me earlier now approached with genuine warmth and curiosity. Dr. Williams from Lake Forest Hospital introduced himself and mentioned they had an opening in their cardiac surgery department. A young woman named Jessica, one of Jonathan's cousins, told me she was applying to medical school and asked if we could talk sometime about choosing surgery as a specialty. But through it all, I kept watching the head table, where Patricia sat rigid as stone, her champagne glass untouched, her smile frozen in place. Richard had leaned over to whisper something to her, but she turned away, focusing intently on adjusting her napkin, her jewelry, anything that didn't require acknowledging what had just happened. The evening wound down gradually. The older guests began leaving first, stopping by my table to introduce themselves or reintroduce themselves with apologies for not recognizing me earlier. Helen Crane walked past without making eye contact, her earlier smugness replaced by tight-lipped embarrassment. It was nearly 11 when I decided to step outside for some air. The garden was quieter now, with most of the reception moved indoors to the ballroom for dancing. String lights still twinkled overhead, and the scent of roses hung heavy in the cooling night air. I was standing near the fountain when I heard footsteps behind me. "I wondered when you'd come find me." Richard Hartwell stepped into the light, still wearing his tuxedo but having loosened his bow tie. He looked older, up close than he had from across the reception, more fragile somehow, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence I remembered. "Hello, Richard." "Sarah," He moved to stand beside me, both of us facing the fountain rather than each other. Hell of a speech Jonathan gave. He didn't need to do that. Yes, he did. Richard's voice was quiet but firm. That boy loves Madison more than life itself, and he wasn't about to let anyone diminish someone who helped shape the woman he fell in love with. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the sound of water from the fountain mixing with distant music from the ballroom. You saved my life, Richard said finally. You had excellent doctors. The cardiac team at Northwestern was... Sarah. He turned to face me fully. I've read the medical records. I know what you did that night. Dr. Peterson told me years later about the fourth-year medical student who insisted on additional testing, who caught the secondary blockage he'd missed. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. I was out of line. I had no business inserting myself into your case. You had every business. You were the only one who cared enough to look beyond the obvious. He paused. Do you know what I thought about during that surgery? I shook my head. I thought about how proud I was of you, how you'd grown into exactly the kind of doctor I'd always believed you could become. Even when you were 19 and following me around construction sites asking a million questions about load-bearing walls. The memory hit me unexpectedly. Richard teaching me about architecture during a college summer when I'd worked as his assistant. Both of us covered in dust and blueprints. Him patiently explaining why certain structures could support weight and others couldn't. I thought about that too, I admitted. About how you taught me that the strongest structures are the ones built on solid foundations, even when you can't see them. And then I woke up, and you were gone. Patricia said you'd left town, that you had school obligations. I didn't find out the truth until months later. What truth? Richard turned to face me fully. That she'd asked you to leave, that she'd told you I didn't want to see you while I was recovering. The words hit like a physical blow. She said you blamed me, for the Morrison case, for the stress it caused your family. I never blamed you, Sarah, never. What you did, testifying against Morrison, that took more courage than anything I've ever done in business or life. His voice cracked slightly. I was ashamed that you had to stand alone, that we didn't stand with you. I closed my eyes, feeling 7 years of carefully constructed acceptance crumbling around me. I thought you hated me. I hated myself for not being strong enough to stand up to Patricia, to the social pressure, to the comfortable lies that kept our world intact. He reached out and took my hand. I hated that I let you walk away thinking I didn't value what you'd done. Before I could respond, we heard the click of heels on stone. Patricia approached from the direction of the house, her posture still perfect but something fragile around the edges. I thought I might find you two here. Richard dropped my hand but didn't step away. Patricia. She looked between us, her expression unreadable. That was quite a surprise tonight. Jonathan's speech. It was the truth, Richard said quietly. The truth. Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. The truth is complicated, Richard. The truth is that Sarah's testimony destroyed James Morrison's career. The truth is that it tore apart relationships that took decades to build. The truth, I said, finding my voice, is that Morrison killed a patient through negligence, and you wanted me to stay quiet about it. Patricia's composure cracked. He made a mistake, one mistake in 30 years of practice. While intoxicated, during a complex cardiac procedure, I am a father of 3 children. He was grieving his own son's death, and I was sorry for his loss. But grief doesn't excuse malpractice. It doesn't make it acceptable to operate when you're not capable of providing safe care. Patricia's hands trembled slightly. You destroyed him. No, Richard said firmly. Morrison destroyed himself. Sarah just refused to help cover it up. Patricia turned on her husband. She chose her principles over our family, over you, when you needed support, not more stress. She saved my life, Richard said. And then she saved other lives by making sure Morrison couldn't harm anyone else. She did exactly what she was trained to do, protect patients. At what cost? Patricia's voice rose. At the cost of relationships, stability, peace? At the cost of staying comfortable while people died, I said. Yes, that was a cost I was willing to pay. Patricia stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. Not acceptance, but perhaps recognition. I don't understand you, she said finally. I never have. The way you're willing to sacrifice everything for abstract principles. They're not abstract when they're someone's life. She nodded slowly, as if finally hearing something she'd been deaf to for years. Jonathan thinks you're a hero. Jonathan sees clearly. Madison worships you. Madison makes her own choices. Patricia looked at Richard, then back at me. And Richard never got over losing you. The admission hung in the air between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. I never got over losing any of you, I said honestly. But I couldn't stay and pretend Morrison's actions were acceptable. I couldn't build my career on a lie. Patricia was quiet for a long time, looking out at the fountain, at the roses, at anything but Richard and me. I was protecting our world, she said finally. I was protecting people who didn't have a world to retreat to, I replied. She nodded again, and when she looked at me this time, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry I made you choose between your integrity and our love. I'm sorry I convinced myself that loyalty to family meant sacrificing truth. I'm sorry I spent 7 years telling myself you were the problem, instead of admitting that maybe our comfortable world was built on foundations that weren't as solid as we pretended. The apology I'd never expected, never asked for, but had needed more than I'd realized. I'm sorry too, I said. Sorry it took so long for us to have this conversation. Richard stepped closer to both of us. So where do we go from here? 6 months later, I stood in front of the Northwestern Memorial Hospital Board of Directors, presenting a proposal that would have seemed impossible before that October wedding. The conference room was packed with hospital administrators, department heads, and 3 investigative journalists who had been following my work since the story broke. The Mitchell Protocol for Medical Ethics and Patient Advocacy, I announced, clicking to the first slide of my presentation, addresses a critical gap in our healthcare system. Currently, there are no formal protections for medical professionals who witness malpractice and choose to report it. The room was attentive in a way that conference rooms rarely are. These weren't people fulfilling an obligation. They were people who understood they were witnessing something significant. Medical professionals who report colleagues for patient safety violations face retaliation, career destruction, and social ostracism. The result is a culture of silence that prioritizes institutional comfort over patient welfare. I clicked to the next slide, showing statistics I'd compiled over months of research. In the past 5 years, 847 medical professionals nationwide have reported witnessing behaviors that compromised patient safety. Of those, 623 faced professional retaliation. 401 were forced to leave their positions. 178 left medicine entirely. Dr. Amanda Chen, the hospital's chief of staff, leaned forward. What are you proposing? A comprehensive support system. Legal representation, career protection, psychological counseling, and financial assistance for medical professionals who report safety violations, plus mandatory training for all staff about patient advocacy responsibilities. The presentation continued for 40 minutes, outlining implementation strategies, funding sources, and measurable outcomes. When I finished, the questions came fast and thoughtful. Who's funding this? Asked the board chair. Initial funding comes from the Hartwell Foundation, with matching grants from 3 other medical foundations. Richard had called me in December, 3 months after the wedding. The conversation had been brief, direct, and life-changing. I want to do something meaningful with our foundation, he'd said. Something that honors what you did, what you've been doing. Will you help me figure out how? The first hospital to implement the Mitchell Protocol was Northwestern Memorial, but within 6 months, 12 other institutions had committed to pilot programs. The response from medical professionals was overwhelming. Phone calls, emails, letters from doctors and nurses who had been carrying the weight of witnessed malpractice for years. Dr. Maria Santos called from Phoenix, crying as she described watching a surgeon operate while clearly intoxicated, knowing she couldn't report it without destroying her own career. Nurse practitioner James Leo wrote from Seattle about documentation he'd seen that proved systematic insurance fraud but felt powerless to address. Each story reinforced what I'd learned 7 years ago. The healthcare system was failing not just patients but the professionals who were supposed to protect them. The protocol's first major test came 8 months after its implementation. Dr. Rebecca Park, a resident in our cardiology department, reported that she'd witnessed an attending physician perform a procedure he wasn't qualified for, resulting in serious complications for the patient. Under the old system, Dr. Park would have faced retaliation, poor evaluations, and probable dismissal. Under the Mitchell Protocol, she received legal representation, career counseling, and protection from professional consequences. The attending physician received additional training and supervision. The patient received appropriate follow-up care and compensation. No one was destroyed. Everyone was protected. The system worked. The media attention was intense, but positive. 60 Minutes did a feature story. The American Medical Association invited me to keynote their annual conference. Medical schools began incorporating the protocol's principles into their ethics curricula. But the moment that mattered most came on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when Madison called. "Sarah, are you sitting down?" "I'm in surgery prep." "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Jonathan and I just found out we're having a baby." The joy in her voice was infectious. "Madison, that's incredible news." "There's more. We want you to be the godmother." I had to sit down then, despite being in surgical scrubs and having a procedure scheduled in 20 minutes. "Are you sure? Have you talked to your parents about this?" "Of course I'm sure. And yes, I've talked to Mom and Dad. Dad actually suggested it. He said the baby should have a godmother who understands that protecting someone sometimes means making difficult choices." That evening, I drove to Lake Forest for dinner at the Hartwell House. It was my 4th visit since the wedding, each one easier than the last. Patricia and I would never be close friends. Too much had happened for that kind of intimacy. But we had reached something more valuable: honest respect. The Foundation Board approved another expansion, Richard told me over coffee. 6 more hospitals, including Children's Memorial. That's wonderful. The pediatric cases are often the most heartbreaking. Patricia set down her cup carefully. "I've been thinking about joining the board." I looked at her in surprise. Patricia had always avoided direct involvement in Richard's business ventures, preferring to focus on social and cultural activities. "The protocol work, I mean," she continued. "I think I could help with the fundraising, the social connections. Maybe some of my influence could be used for something genuinely important." It was an olive branch, an acknowledgement that her skills and connections could serve purposes beyond maintaining social harmony. "I think that would be valuable," I said honestly. Later that evening, I stood in Madison's old bedroom, now converted into a nursery in progress. Soft yellow walls, gender-neutral decorations, a crib that Richard had assembled with the same meticulous attention he'd once brought to construction projects. "We haven't told anyone the name yet," Madison said, her hand resting on her still small bump. "But if it's a girl, we're thinking of Sarah." I felt tears sting my eyes. "Madison, you don't have to." "I want to. I want her to have a name that means strength, integrity, courage under pressure. I want her to grow up knowing that some things are worth fighting for, even when it's hard." As I drove back to Chicago that night, I thought about the girl I'd been 7 years ago. Desperate for belonging, willing to compromise almost anything for acceptance. I thought about the woman I'd become, alone but not lonely, principled but not rigid, successful on terms I'd defined for myself. The Mitchell Protocol had given me a platform I'd never expected. Speaking engagements, consulting opportunities, a book deal that would allow me to reach even more medical professionals struggling with ethical dilemmas. But more than career success, it had given me purpose beyond my own advancement. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Park. "Just wanted to let you know, the patient I reported about last month, she's fully recovered and back home with her family. Thank you for making it possible to speak up." Another text, from a nurse in Denver, used the protocol today to report unsafe staffing levels. Administration listened instead of retaliating. Patients are getting better care because of your work. I pulled into my apartment building's parking garage and sat for a moment. Engine off. City lights reflecting off the concrete walls. 7 years ago, I'd chosen truth over comfort and lost everything I thought I wanted. Tonight, I was driving home from dinner with a family who valued my integrity, carrying news about a goddaughter who would bear my name, knowing that my work was protecting patients and medical professionals across the country. The choice I'd made hadn't been wrong. It had just taken time for the world to catch up to its rightness. I walked into my apartment, the same one I'd lived in for 3 years, but now filled with flowers from grateful patients, photos from medical conferences, and a growing collection of thank you letters from healthcare workers who no longer had to choose between their careers and their consciences. On my kitchen counter sat Madison's wedding invitation, now framed. Not as a memento of the past, but as a reminder of what was possible when courage was met with recognition, when truth was finally given the respect it deserved. I had once been the woman who wasn't on the guest list. Now I was the woman whose work ensured that others wouldn't have to choose between belonging and doing what was right. The transformation was complete. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.